The summer heat in East Nashville had a way of making everything feel slower, heavier, like the air itself was holding its breath. On July 23, 1994, the temperature climbed to 97 degrees by noon, and the humidity made it feel like walking through soup. In the small frame house on Woodland Street, 62-year-old Earl Cooper sat on his front porch, watching his prize rooster strut around the dusty yard behind a chain-link fence. That rooster, a magnificent red-feathered gamecock named Thunder, represented more than just a bird to Earl. Thunder was his legacy, his pride, and his ticket to respect in a community where respect was earned through grit, tradition, and the fierce loyalty of family. Earl had been raising fighting cocks for 38 years, following in the footsteps of his father and grandfather before him. The Cooper family had deep roots in Nashville, stretching back to the 1920s when Earl's grandfather, Thomas Cooper, moved from rural Kentucky to find work in the city's growing industrial sector. Thomas brought with him the mountain traditions of his people, including the ancient practice of cockfighting. For 3 generations, the Cooper men had bred, trained, and fought their birds in the underground circuit that thrived in the shadows of Music City's more famous entertainment industry. Thunder was special, even by Cooper family standards. The 3-year-old rooster had never lost a fight, earning Earl over $15,000 in prize money and establishing him as one of the most respected handlers in the regional circuit. Thunder's bloodline traced back to champions from the 1960s, and Earl had spent countless hours conditioning the bird, working with him daily in the small training pen behind the house. The rooster's spurs were razor-sharp, his reflexes lightning quick, and his fighting spirit legendary among the tight-knit community of cockfighters who gathered in barns and warehouses across Tennessee and Kentucky. But Thunder represented more than money or prestige to the Cooper family. Earl's son Bobby, 34 years old and recently laid off from the Ford plant, had been helping his father with the bird since childhood. Bobby's twin boys, 8-year-old twins, Jake and Jesse, loved spending time with their grandfather and had already started learning the intricate art of bird care. Earl's daughter Linda, 32 and divorced, lived in the house next door with her teenage son Marcus. For the Coopers, the roosters weren't just a hobby or a business. They were a connection to their heritage, a source of pride in a world that often looked down on their working-class lifestyle. The trouble started 3 weeks earlier when Earl refused to sell Thunder to Vincent "Vince" Torino, a newcomer to Nashville who had money but no respect for the traditions that governed the cockfighting world. Torino, originally from New Jersey, had moved to Tennessee with plans to break into the country music business. When that dream soured, he discovered the underground fighting circuit and saw it as an easy way to make quick cash. Torino had heard about Thunder's reputation and showed up at Earl's house on July 2nd with an offer of $25,000 cash for the bird. Earl's refusal was immediate and absolute. Thunder wasn't for sale at any price, and Earl made it clear that Torino's money meant nothing to him. The confrontation that followed revealed the deep cultural divide between the established Nashville families and the outsiders who saw their traditions as nothing more than business opportunities. Torino accused Earl of being stuck in the past, while Earl questioned Torino's right to even participate in a world he clearly didn't understand or respect. The tension escalated when Torino began showing up at local fights with his own birds and a crew of followers who shared his aggressive, money-first approach to the sport. This group, which locals quickly dubbed Torino's Thugs, I'd included several men with criminal backgrounds who had followed Vince from New Jersey. There was Tommy the Hammer Castellano, a former enforcer for loan sharks who stood 6'4" and weighed 260 pounds. Michael "Mikey" Russo brought expertise in illegal gambling operations, while his brother Anthony "Tony" Russo handled intimidation tactics. The crew also included local recruits like Danny Morrison, a meth dealer from Antioch, who saw association with Torino as a path to bigger opportunities. What happened at the July 15th fight in a barn outside Murfreesboro should have served as a warning to everyone involved. Thunder dominated his opponent, a bird Torino had brought from out of state, winning in under 3 minutes and earning Earl another $2,000 in side bets. But instead of accepting the loss, Torino's crew began making threats, suggesting that Earl's winning streak was somehow suspicious or unfair. The accusation of cheating was the gravest insult possible in the cockfighting world, where honor and integrity were everything. The confrontation outside the barn that night nearly turned violent when Tommy Castellano grabbed Earl by the shirt and accused him of drugging his birds. Bobby Cooper stepped in immediately, and for a moment it looked like the situation might explode into an all-out brawl. Only the intervention of other handlers, men who respected Earl's reputation and wanted to avoid bringing unwanted attention to their sport, prevented the fight from escalating. But everyone knew this wasn't over. Earl Cooper wasn't the type of man to be intimidated, despite his age. Born in 1932, he had served 2 tours in Korea and came home to work 30 years at the DuPont plant before retiring in 1987. His military service had taught him about loyalty, courage, and standing your ground when threatened. His years in the chemical plant had shown him the value of hard work and the importance of family. Earl's wife Martha had died of cancer 3 years earlier, and since then, his birds and his family had become even more central to his identity. The week following the Murfreesboro incident, strange things began happening around the Cooper property. Someone cut the lock on the training pen one night, though nothing was stolen. Trash appeared scattered across the front yard on 2 separate mornings. A brick was thrown through the window of Linda's house, and threatening phone calls began coming at all hours. The message was clear: sell the bird or face escalating consequences. Earl's response was to increase security around his property and prepare for war. He installed motion sensor lights, reinforced the fences around his bird pens, and began carrying his grandfather's .38 revolver whenever he left the house. More importantly, he called a family meeting that included not just Bobby and Linda, but also his brothers James and Robert, both Vietnam veterans who lived within 10 miles of the Woodland Street house. The Cooper family had always been close-knit, and the threat to Earl and his birds was seen as a threat to all of them. James Cooper, 58 years old and a retired Metro Nashville police officer, brought a law enforcement perspective to the family's planning. He knew that going to the police about threats related to illegal cockfighting would be futile at best and potentially disastrous at worst. The underground nature of their sport meant they couldn't rely on official protection. Robert Cooper, 55, and a former Army Ranger who now worked construction, contributed tactical expertise and a collection of legally owned firearms that had been accumulating for decades. The family meeting on July 20th lasted until nearly midnight. They gathered in Earl's kitchen, the same room where 3 generations of Cooper men had planned their bird training schedules and discussed the challenges of maintaining their traditions in a changing world. Martha's china still filled the cabinets, and her recipe cards were still taped to the refrigerator, creating a poignant backdrop for a conversation about violence and family honor. Bobby's wife Susan initially argued against any form of confrontation, worried about the safety of the twin boys, but when Linda described finding strange men watching her teenage son Marcus walk home from school, the family consensus shifted toward decisive action. These weren't just threats against Earl and his rooster anymore. Torino's crew was threatening the entire family, including the children. The plan that emerged from that kitchen table meeting was both simple and comprehensive. If Torino's people made any direct move against the family or the birds, the Coopers would respond with overwhelming force. They would not initiate violence, but they would finish any fight that was brought to them. James used his police contacts to gather intelligence on Torino's crew, learning about their criminal backgrounds and identifying their usual hangouts. Robert scouted the approaches to the family property and identified the best defensive positions. Earl, despite his age, insisted on being at the center of any action. The breaking point came on the morning of July 23rd. Earl woke up at 5:15 a.m. as usual, made his coffee, and walked out to check on his birds. The training pen was empty. Thunder was gone, along with 2 other valuable roosters. The lock had been cut cleanly, and tire tracks in the soft dirt showed where a vehicle had been parked behind the house during the night. A note was left tied to the gate. "Your birds are safe for now. Bring $50,000 cash to the warehouse on Elm Hill Pike at midnight tonight, or you'll never see them again." Earl's hands shook as he held the note, not from fear but from pure rage. In 62 years of life, he had never felt such a complete violation of everything he held sacred. These men had stolen more than just roosters. They had stolen his heritage, his pride, and his connection to 3 generations of family tradition. As he stood in the empty pen where thunder should have been strutting in the morning sun, Earl Cooper made a decision that would echo through Nashville's criminal underworld for decades to come. The call went out to the family network at 5:45 a.m. Within an hour, James and Robert had arrived at the Woodland Street house, followed by Bobby, who had left his factory job after explaining the emergency to his supervisor. Linda sent Marcus to stay with friends and arranged for the twins to spend the day at their cousin's house across town. By 7:30 a.m., the core Cooper family was assembled and planning their response. James Cooper's police experience proved invaluable in the intelligence-gathering phase. Through his contacts in the department, he learned that Torino's crew had been staying at a rundown motel on Murfreesboro Pike and operating out of an abandoned warehouse in the Elm Hill Industrial District. More crucially, he discovered that Vincent Torino was planning to leave Nashville within the week, taking his stolen roosters to cockfighting circuits in Louisiana and Texas, where his crimes would be harder to trace. The warehouse on Elm Hill Pike sat in an industrial area that had seen better days. Built in the 1960s to support Nashville's growing manufacturing sector, it had been abandoned for 3 years when the textile company that owned it went bankrupt. The building was perfect for Torino's purposes, isolated with multiple entrances and exits, and far enough from residential areas that noise wouldn't attract unwanted attention. What Torino and his crew didn't realize was that Robert Cooper had worked construction in that same industrial district for over a decade. He knew every building, every alley, and every sightline in the area. More importantly, he knew that the warehouse had been built with a supervisor's office that overlooked the main floor from a second-story perch, a perfect sniper's nest for someone with Robert's military training. The Cooper family plan was methodical and precise. They would arrive at the warehouse several hours before the scheduled midnight meeting, position themselves strategically around the building, and wait to see how many of Torino's people showed up. If the numbers were manageable, they would attempt to rescue the birds without bloodshed. But if Torino brought his full crew, or if any member of the Cooper family was threatened, they were prepared to eliminate every threat permanently. The afternoon of July 23rd passed slowly for the Cooper family. Earl spent hours cleaning and checking his weapons, including the .38 revolver that had belonged to his grandfather and a 12-gauge shotgun he had used for hunting since the 1960s. James contributed a .40 caliber Glock from his police service and a deer rifle with a high-powered scope. Robert brought an arsenal that reflected his military background and construction work connections. A modified AR-15, a .30-06 hunting rifle, and several handguns, including a .357 Magnum that could stop a charging bull. Bobby, the youngest of the men, had the least firearms experience but the most to lose. His twin boys represented the fourth generation of Cooper tradition, and the thought of Torino's threats against his family filled him with a cold fury that surprised even his father and uncles. Bobby's weapon of choice was a pump-action 20-gauge shotgun that had belonged to his grandfather Thomas, creating a symbolic link to the family patriarch who had started the Cooper cockfighting tradition 70 years earlier. As evening approached, the family gathered one final time in Earl's kitchen. The conversation was subdued, focused on practical matters like communication signals and fallback positions. But underneath the tactical discussions lay a deeper understanding. This wasn't just about recovering stolen roosters anymore. This was about defending a way of life that had sustained the Cooper family for 3 generations, and ensuring that it would survive for the 4th. At 9:30 p.m., 4 vehicles left the Woodland Street house at staggered intervals. James drove his personal truck to a position where he could observe the warehouse's main entrance from across the industrial park. Robert took his construction van to the building's rear, where loading docks provided multiple access points. Bobby parked his Ford pickup in an alley that offered a clear escape route while maintaining visual contact with his father and uncles. Earl, carrying Thunder's carrying case as a psychological reminder of what they were fighting for, positioned himself closest to the warehouse's front entrance. The industrial district at 10:45 p.m. was a maze of shadows and sodium vapor lights, creating an eerie landscape of orange pools of light separated by areas of complete darkness. The July heat still radiated from the concrete and asphalt, and the humidity made every sound seem muffled and distant. Crickets provided a constant background noise, punctuated occasionally by the distant hum of traffic on the interstate. Robert Cooper reached his position first, using skills learned in Vietnam jungle warfare to approach the warehouse undetected. The building showed signs of recent activity: fresh tire tracks in the gravel parking lot, lights visible through dirty windows on the second floor, and the faint sound of voices coming from inside the structure. Most tellingly, 3 expensive-looking cars were parked near the loading dock: a black Cadillac with New Jersey plates, a red Corvette, and a white BMW that James had seen at the Murfreesboro cockfight. The Cooper family communication system was simple but effective. Each man carried a small 2-way radio that James had borrowed from his police contacts. At 11:15 p.m., the intelligence picture became clear through a series of whispered radio reports. Torino had brought at least 8 men to the warehouse, far more than the 4 or 5 the family had expected. Worse, several of the men were carrying visible weapons, handguns in shoulder holsters, and what appeared to be a sawed-off shotgun. Earl's voice came through the radio at 11:22 p.m., calm and resolved. "Boys, they've got our birds in cages on the main floor. I can see Thunder in the center cage. These sons of bitches are planning to keep our roosters regardless of what we do tonight." The confirmation that this was indeed a trap, rather than a genuine ransom attempt, eliminated any remaining hope for a peaceful resolution. The warehouse interior, visible through grimy windows, had been arranged like an arena. Temporary bleachers surrounded a small fighting pit in the center of the floor, and several cages containing roosters were positioned around the perimeter. It became clear that Torino wasn't just planning to steal the Cooper birds. He was setting up his own fighting operation using stolen stock from established Nashville families. At 11:45 p.m., 15 minutes before the scheduled meeting time, Earl made the decision that would define the rest of the night. His voice over the radio was steady and determined. "We're not negotiating with these thieves, and we're not letting them keep what belongs to our family. When I give the word, we go in hard and fast. Remember, they chose this fight when they came onto our property and stole what's ours." The first shot came at 11:52 p.m., 8 minutes before the official meeting time. One of Torino's sentries, positioned outside the warehouse's side entrance, spotted movement in the shadows and fired a warning shot into the air while shouting an alarm to his companions inside. That shot was the signal for everything the Cooper family had planned to begin. Robert Cooper's military training took over as he moved through the industrial complex with the fluid precision of a veteran soldier. His first target was the sentry who had fired the warning shot, a thin man in his 20s who appeared to be more nervous than experienced. Robert's approach was silent and efficient, neutralizing the threat before the man could fire a second shot or raise any further alarm. Inside the warehouse, chaos erupted as Torino's crew realized they were under attack, rather than meeting with a frightened old man carrying ransom money. The industrial building's acoustics amplified every sound, turning shouts into echoes and footsteps into thunder. Vincent Torino screamed orders at his men while simultaneously trying to use a cell phone to call for backup that would never arrive. James Cooper entered through the warehouse's main floor, using his police training to move tactically from cover to cover. His first encounter was with Michael Russo, who had been positioned near the stolen roosters with instructions to kill the birds if anything went wrong. The confrontation lasted less than 30 seconds, ending with Russo on the concrete floor and the Cooper family birds safe from immediate harm. The fighting spread throughout the warehouse as Torino's crew attempted to organize a defense against attackers they couldn't see clearly in the building's dim lighting. Tommy Castellano, the former enforcer who had threatened Earl outside the Murfreesboro barn, found himself face-to-face with Bobby Cooper near the makeshift fighting pit. The younger Cooper man's fury at seeing his family's stolen birds gave him a strength and determination that surprised the much larger opponent. Earl Cooper, despite being the oldest man in the building, proved that 6 decades of hard living and 2 tours in Korea had forged him into someone not easily intimidated. His encounter with Anthony Russo near the warehouse's front entrance was brief but decisive, demonstrating that age had not diminished his capacity for defending what mattered most to him. The gun battle that followed was intense, but surprisingly short-lived. Torino's crew, despite their criminal experience, had never faced opponents like the Cooper family, men who were fighting not for money or territory, but for heritage, pride, and family honor. The difference in motivation became apparent as the New Jersey transplants found themselves outmaneuvered and outfought by Nashville natives who knew exactly what they were fighting for. Vincent Torino himself attempted to escape through the warehouse's rear loading dock, carrying a briefcase that presumably contained money from his planned cockfighting operation. His flight was cut short by Robert Cooper, who had positioned himself precisely where his construction experience told him any fleeing suspect would emerge. The confrontation between the two men embodied the larger conflict. An outsider who saw Nashville traditions as business opportunities facing a man whose family had helped create and preserve those traditions for 3 generations. The warehouse fell silent at 12:17 a.m. on July 24th, 25 minutes after the first shot had been fired. 14 members of Torino's crew lay dead throughout the building, victims of what would later be called one of the most decisive family conflicts in Nashville's criminal history. The Cooper family had suffered no fatalities and only minor injuries, a testament to their superior planning, knowledge of the terrain, and unshakable determination to protect what belonged to them. Thunder and the other stolen roosters were recovered unharmed from their cages, though the birds showed signs of stress from their captivity. Earl's hands shook slightly as he opened Thunder's cage and lifted his prize rooster, feeling the bird's familiar weight and strength. For a moment, surrounded by the aftermath of violence in a warehouse that would never be the same, the old man allowed himself to feel the full relief of having his legacy restored. The cleanup that followed demonstrated the Cooper family's understanding that their actions, while justified in their minds, would bring consequences that required careful management. Using Robert's construction connections, the family arranged for the warehouse to be completely sanitized, with all evidence of the gun battle removed or destroyed. The bodies of Torino's crew were disposed of in ways that ensured they would never be found by law enforcement. The Cooper family's actions that night sent shockwaves through Nashville's underground fighting circuit, but not in the way outsiders might have expected. Rather than being condemned for their violence, Earl and his family were widely respected for their decisive response to an unprecedented threat. The message was clear. Nashville's cockfighting families would not tolerate outsiders who tried to destroy their traditions through theft and intimidation. In the weeks that followed the warehouse incident, several other out-of-state groups that had been moving into Tennessee's fighting circuit quietly withdrew from the area. The Cooper family's reputation for decisive action served as a deterrent that protected not just their own operation, but the entire network of families who had maintained cockfighting traditions for generations. Earl Cooper continued fighting Thunder for another 2 years, during which the rooster's reputation grew even larger. The bird's association with the family that had fought 14 men to rescue him added a legendary quality to his already impressive fighting record. Thunder retired undefeated in 1996, living out his final years in Earl's backyard and siring a new generation of champion fighting cocks. Bobby Cooper took over the family's bird operation when Earl's health began declining in 1998. The twins, Jake and Jesse, proved to have inherited their grandfather's instinct for breeding and training fighting cocks, ensuring that the 4th generation of Cooper cockfighters would continue the family tradition. Both boys grew up hearing the story of the night their father and grandfather fought to protect their heritage, and both understood that being a Cooper meant being willing to defend what mattered most. Linda Cooper moved to Florida in 1999, wanting to distance herself and her son Marcus from the violence that had touched their family. She maintained contact with her father and brother, but never fully reconciled herself to the actions they had taken that July night. Marcus, however, returned to Nashville after college and eventually joined the family bird operation, drawn by the same traditions that had motivated his grandfather and uncles. James Cooper retired from the Metro Nashville Police Department in 2001, never having faced any official scrutiny for his role in the warehouse incident. His law enforcement contacts had ensured that the investigation into Vincent Torino's disappearance remained perfunctory, officially classified as the departure of known criminals who had likely moved on to easier targets in other states. Robert Cooper continued his construction business until 2005, when a heart attack forced him into early retirement. He spent his remaining years helping Earl and Bobby maintain their bird operation, passing on the tactical skills that had proved so crucial during the warehouse confrontation. Robert died in 2008, taking with him detailed knowledge of exactly how 14 bodies had disappeared so completely that no trace was ever found. Earl Cooper passed away peacefully in 2010 at the age of 78, surrounded by his family and with Thunder's descendants strutting in the yard outside his bedroom window. His funeral was attended by cockfighting families from across the Southeast, many of whom credited Earl's actions in 1994 with preserving their sport from the kind of criminal exploitation that had destroyed fighting circuits in other regions. The warehouse on Elm Hill Pike was demolished in 2003 to make way for a shopping center, ensuring that the last physical evidence of that July night disappeared forever. But the story of the Cooper family's stand against Vincent Torino and his crew continued to circulate through the underground fighting circuit, growing into legend with each retelling. 28 years later, in 2022, Bobby Cooper still operates his family's bird breeding program from the same woodland street house where his father made the decision to fight back against impossible odds. The twins, now in their 30s, each maintain their own fighting operations while continuing to breed from Thunder's bloodline. The sport of cockfighting has changed dramatically since 1994, with increased legal pressure and changing social attitudes reducing the number of active participants. But the families who remain committed to the tradition still remember the night when one Nashville family proved that some things are worth fighting for, regardless of the consequences. The Cooper family has never spoken publicly about what happened in that warehouse, and no member of Torino's crew was ever seen again in Tennessee or anywhere else. Law enforcement files from the period show no record of any investigation into the disappearance of 14 criminals whose absence from the Nashville underworld was noted but never explained. The silence surrounding the incident has only added to its legendary status among those who understand that in some communities justice is administered by families rather than courts. Today, when young cockfighters ask about the history of their sport in Nashville, they inevitably hear the story of Earl Cooper and his prize rooster Thunder. But more than a tale of stolen birds and recovered pride, it has become a story about the lengths to which a family will go to preserve what defines them, and the terrible, swift justice that can emerge when outsiders threaten the traditions that bind communities together across generations. The legacy of that July night in 1994 extends beyond the cockfighting community to represent a broader truth about Nashville's character. This is a city where transplants and locals coexist peacefully as long as everyone respects the traditions and values that existed before they arrived. But those who mistake Southern hospitality for weakness, or who assume that age-old customs can be exploited for quick profit, occasionally discover that some communities have their own ways of dealing with threats to their way of life. In the end, the story of Earl Cooper, his rooster Thunder, and the warehouse where 14 criminals met their fate serves as both a historical account and a continuing warning. Nashville remains a city where family honor matters, where traditions run deep, and where those who threaten what people hold most sacred may find themselves facing consequences far more severe than anything the official justice system would impose. The Cooper family name is still respected throughout Tennessee's underground fighting circuit, and Thunder's bloodline continues to produce champions in rings across the Southeast. But perhaps more importantly, the family's willingness to risk everything to defend their heritage has ensured that their traditions will survive for future generations, passed down through families who understand that some legacies are worth any sacrifice to preserve.